Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this lecture, this book presentation with distinguished economist John Cochrane. It's been quite a while, right? We are slowly getting back into holding IMFS lectures and presentations physically. So we also did not do it hybrid. We do a recording and post it on YouTube later in our website. My name is Volker Wieland. I'm Managing Director of IMFS. So I'm delighted that we have John here today. He's in for a very short visit. You also spend time at the ECB, and we have some ECB people here. It's great to have you. John Cochrane is very well known to you. He's world famous for his work on asset pricing, his asset pricing textbook, and all this research. Actually going back, you did your PhD at Berkeley, and I know maybe one reason why you moved back to the Bay Area. You did your PhD at Berkeley, although you studied physics at MIT before, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then you spent almost 30 years at Chicago, right? And first at the Department of Economics, then at the business school with many stints in other places visiting, but basically firmly anchored in Chicago. And a few years ago, you came to the Hoover Institution, where, just to read this correctly, you're the Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. We also want to get more of these named professorships. So if you know anyone who wants to donate, I think we can make something happen. Also here. I need to tell that also to some entrepreneurs. But anyway, so it's great to have you. I've had the pleasure of interacting with you also at Hoover. And in the last, now you said today, 10 years, right? You've been working a lot on the monetary policy side, the monetary economic side, but basically deriving monetary dynamics from fiscal budgets and developing and enhancing the fiscal theory of the price level. And you thought that it's so spread out in different papers, you wanted to put it into a book, and the book is out, and this is what we're talking about today, the Fiscal Theory of the Price Level. The new book, it's out at Princeton University Press. I saw also, by the way, you have a long-time course related to your asset pricing book. So maybe we can expect in the future an online course to your fiscal book. So we have lots of students here. We have also people from the financial community, colleagues from the faculty, but also other people from the public, interested public here. So thanks a lot, and I'll hand over directly to you.
How long are we supposed to go?
I think we have announced up to 6 p.m. I think there are questions we can go over. Also, do you want to take the questions during the talk or during? Okay, so you're free to ask, and then if you think it goes too long with a particular question, it's up to you to stop it. I saw also you won many teaching prizes. So you have no problem managing.
I come from Chicago, where if somebody doesn't stand up every 5 minutes and say, "This is totally wrong, you moron," I feel like, I'm putting you to sleep. So make sure you make me feel at home. So it's a great pleasure to be back. It's been since before Corona that I was able to. Last time I came, Volker invited me to a conference involving the ECB, and I talked to you. And I realized in horror, as I was putting up the slides, that the title was the same. But in case there's anyone who remembers, I'll emphasize update. As in fact, a lot has happened since then, including the publication of the book. Today, in fact, I should say, go buy the book, because I'm on a book tour, but don't. It's full of equations. It's designed to convince people like Volker or PhD students to teach you how to do fiscal theory. But today, mostly I'll talk about a paper, Fiscal Histories, which is a sequel. I wrote this as for the Journal of Economic Perspectives, where my directions were to do this with no equations, which is, for a recovering business school professor, that's like giving a talk with no slides. It was very difficult, but that's what I'm going to talk mostly about that. So I encourage you to get that, and it's free. You just go to my website, where's the book you have to pay for. I'm also, the last preface, I have to say, I think I'm the luckiest economist on the planet. I've actually been working on this topic since the spring of 1980, long time on and off. Most of you weren't born back then. It takes a while to get this stuff done. And I'm kind of lazy, but eventually I turned in a manuscript in January of 2021, and there was no inflation. And the original introduction of the book said, well, look, we haven't seen inflation since the 1980s. Nobody cares about inflation. My colleagues tell me stop working on inflation because it's just a solved problem. But who knows, maybe someday, decades from now, this book, take this off the shelf, you might find it useful. And the essence of the book is that if the government prints up $55 trillion of money and gives everybody a check, you're going to get some inflation. Immediately after turning in my manuscript, the government printed up $5 trillion of money and sent everybody a check, and we got some inflation. So laziness paid off, and I turned out to be pretty lucky. Couldn't get me to get Princeton to publish it any faster, but here we are. So what is this fiscal theory of the price level? The governing equation is that the real value of nominal government debt must equal the present value of primary government surpluses that are going to retire that debt. This is just like price of stock equals present value of dividends. And you can recognize, I'm one of those people like, the famous 2-year-old who gets a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So the one hammer I got was price is present value of dividends. My career in asset pricing, the whole book comes down to you need to know this one fact, and here's where everything else comes from. And this really is asset pricing imperialism to try to take over monetary economics with the same basic idea. Now, how does this work? Suppose you're sitting on money, which is a form of government debt, or bonds, and you suspect that your government doesn't really have a plan for paying this stuff off, and it will eventually get inflated away. Well, you want to get rid of it now before it loses value. So how do you get rid of government debt and money? Collectively, the only way to do this is to try to buy stuff with it. So if we all go out and try to buy stuff with our government debt and money, that sends the price of stuff up. So in the end, it's just another statement of too much money chasing too few goods, except that money is measured, how much money is too much relative to our expectations that the government will soak that money up again with taxes. So government can, if there's too much money floating around, the government can get rid of it by, they give it to us in taxes. And if you don't think the government's going to be able to do that, then you have too much money floating around and that causes inflation. So that's not, if you understand prices, present value, if that makes sense, that's the basic mechanism and not a big surprise. Now, key important question, key important prediction. That does not mean that inflation is tightly linked to today's debt and deficits. And the first questions that always go up, especially when people aren't as polite as you are, is, well, what about Japan? Or what about, what about right now? Why did, we have debts? Why wasn't there inflation in 2008? No, today's debt and today's deficit is not tightly linked to inflation in the theory. Why? Because what matters is today's debt and deficit relative to the expectation that the government can pay that debt off over long periods of time. So the top graph, this is good debt. There is good, government debt is a great and wonderful thing because in a time of emergency, a war, a pandemic, a recession, a crisis, the government should borrow a tremendous amount of money. Our governments do. Our governments should then pay that debt off slowly over time. And if it does so, the present value of surpluses there has not changed at all, and there is no inflation. That's good debt. And debt is a good thing when there's a plan to pay it off. Just like your debt. If you, borrow money to buy a house, you have a deficit, you have some surpluses, debt. So it does not predict all debt and deficits lead to inflation. Only debt and deficits when people don't think there's a plan to pay it back. So second one is bad. Here is a big deficit, but no good plan to pay it back. Well, now the present value of surpluses here is negative, and so it's going down. The present value of surpluses has declined. The right-hand side goes down. The only way the left-hand side can go down is for the price level to go up. So that's like a decline, a permanent decline in dividends. So that's good and that's bad. And you can see they both have a big debt and deficit right here. So that makes it tricky because we have to think about debt and deficit relative to expectations of it'll get paid back. The third thing that can happen is you can have this. Nothing really happens today, but people lose faith in the government's institutions or pay things back in the future. And if people say, no particular news today, but we lose faith in our institutions, then you try to get rid of government debt today, and what you see is inflation breaking out with no big news, which also happens. So a theory that predicts inflation can break out suddenly and unexpectedly without news, that's a good theory because that seems to happen fairly often, but that's another mechanism to keep. Now, what do I mean by expected future payment? It is not, psychologically, people don't sit in their kitchens and say, I think that combined federal deficit in the year 2035 is going to be 2.2% of GDP. Just as people don't really sit down and think, well, I think Twitter is going to be making exactly how much 50 years from now, what shall I pay for the stock? Especially for government debt, it really comes down to the people have faith in the institutions. We have lots of institutions designed to guarantee repayment of debts. We're talking about the Stability and Growth Pact right now. What is that? That is a European institution designed to try to get governments, when they borrow money, to commit to ways to repay it. So really, it's about faith or loss of faith in those institutions. The last thing that the present value, the insight it gives you, is that present value discount rates matter in present values. It's not just about expected surpluses or expected dividends. And another way of putting that statement is that interest costs on the debt matter a huge amount for understanding the sustainability of debt and for therefore understanding inflation. If the interest costs on the debt go up, so this is a quiz for students, in the present value, suppose that the real rate of return, the interest costs go up. What happens to the present value? Goes down, so that causes inflation. And so higher real interest rates on their own are an inflationary force. Put another way, higher interest rates mean that governments have to spend more in debt service. Spending more in debt service, that has to come from taxes or lower spending on something else. And if it doesn't, that's just like deficits that aren't going to be repaid. So higher debt service costs are an inflationary force. And that's certainly something we're all looking at right in the face right now. If our central banks raise interest rates, that's going to raise debt service costs. Who's going to pay for that? Either that means more taxes to pay for it or an additional inflationary force that makes it harder for central banks. So that's the fiscal theory of the price level with no equations. You want equations? Go to the book. Volker, are you having trouble?
No, I'm just, since you said that's the fiscal theory of the price level, but isn't that all also consistent with going back to Sergeant Wallet's unpleasant monetary arithmetic, or unpleasant monetary arithmetic? So maybe you could say one or two words more. What distinguishes the fiscal theory of the price level from that type of analysis, which also relates inflation to the expected future?
Let me do that at the end of the next slide.
Okay.
And if I go on to slide number 3 without answering your question,
Okay.
tell me the answer to that. Because what you're really asking is, what about money? So there's many other theories, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on other theories of the price level, but the most common one is money supply and money demand, which is, which you're probably still taught about where inflation comes from. So how is this different from money supply and money demand? And I put up here, Milton Friedman actually had his license plate was MV equal to Y. I hope someday to convince the California Department of Motor Vehicles to let me put that on my license plate, but for the moment, it's going to have to be a really big bumper sticker. Inflation comes from too much money, not from too much government debt. What's the difference between what I'm saying and monetary? Milton was 98% right, but 2% wrong. In this. Now, so where does fiscal theory agree with monetarism? If you drop money from helicopters, it took me a while to find that on Google, that's going to cause inflation. That's sort of principle number 1 of monetarism. It's also principle 1 of fiscal theory of the price level, because money is just one more form of nominal government debt. Money is non-interest paying, short-term government, instantaneous maturity government debt. So, you put more stuff on the top of the left-hand side, no change in surpluses, you're going to get an increase in the price level. And in fact, the whole key to causing inflation is in the fiscal theory of the price level is to convince people that you're issuing debt, but you have no plans to pay it back. That's kind of hard to do, actually. Japan's been trying. And no one seems to believe them when they say, we're not going to pay back this debt, because you'll pay back. So you need some psychological device to convince people that you're not going to pay back the debt. And what's a better psychological device of convincing people this is irresponsible debt that we will not pay back than to drop it from helicopters? So in fact, Milton Friedman's helicopters, they were a brilliant piece of psychology and central banker communication about we're not going to raise taxes to soak this back up again. So we agree on that one. Where do we disagree? Monetarism would say that the principles of money causing debt says, well, what if we drop $5 trillion in money from the helicopter, but simultaneously we come take back $5 trillion worth of treasury bills from your safe? Now, wait a minute, you're not any better off before you got a stimulus check in the US for $20,000. So we give you your stimulus check for $20,000 in cash, but we take back $20,000 in treasuries. Now, are you going to run out and save it, spend it? Sorry. Well, that's much less obvious, right? You're no wealthier. There's something wrong with the composition of your portfolio. You're supposed to run out and spend it because you have too many liquid assets and not enough illiquid assets, even though your overall assets are the same. Far from obvious that that's the case. And fiscal theory says the first order doesn't matter. That giving you $20,000 in a bank account and taking away $20,000 in a mutual fund that holds treasury bonds is like taking it back, giving you, two $5 bills and taking back a $10 bill. It doesn't make you difference. So that's really the big difference between monetarism and fiscal theory. At a deeper level, if you like these big words, the question is a wealth effect of government debt versus a composition. Is it about the total amount of assets versus how much liquid or illiquid assets you have? That makes it a quite different. But the most important reason to say goodbye to monetarism, it's a beautiful theory, logically consistent, but it doesn't describe our economies. Our central banks do not limit the money supply. For money supply equal money demand to determine the level of prices, you need someone limiting the money supply. If the government gives you as much money as you want, then the price level is anything under monetarism. Our central banks set interest rates. And let's bring back Milton Friedman from the dead, which I'd love to do. Say, well, Milton, wake up. Wakes up and says, what happens if the central bank pegs interest rates? Milton would say, the price level explodes. You're not allowed to do that. Well, our central banks set interest rates. Furthermore, they pay interest on reserves. They make no pretense. They don't even tell you the money supply anymore. And they make no pretense of controlling it. There's no more reserve requirements. We're awash in liquid financial stuff. So M equals PY is the correct theory, but it does not apply to our. We need a theory of inflation that works when the central bank sets an interest rate target. And that's the one we got. Okay. Unless anyone wants to revive monetarism. Oh, I promised Cochrane. So what about unpleasant monetarist arithmetic? Sergeant Wallace started this all off in the 1980s with a brilliant series of papers making the point that monetary policy and fiscal policy are connected. Now that's even true of monetarism. Milton Friedman recognized that almost all the cases of printing up money, too much money, were cases of printing up money to finance government deficits, i.e. cases of fiscal theory. Not cases where central banks were so dumb that they gave you too much of this kind of government debt and not enough of that kind. So Tom Sargent noticed the deficits of the 1980s and said these will have to be financed by printing up money, either now or later. So he had underlined it, too much money, M equals PY, is the theory of inflation. But we don't need that. You don't need money at all. We can just have government debt. So that's one difference, Volker. And the other difference is he had real debt and we have nominal debt. So we still have the flavor of unpleasant arithmetic, but it's not unpleasant monetarist arithmetic. It's unpleasant interest rate arithmetic, which I'll show you. At least I silenced Volker. I don't know if I answered his question. Okay, so let me show you some classic, how does fiscal theory, what does it say will happen? So let me show you two classic exercises of what might happen in the economy. So those of you who do macro, these are impulse response functions of a simple model where the Fed sets interest rates, there are sticky, or the European Central Bank, there are sticky prices, but we also have fiscal theory going on. And if you just look at the answers, you'll see what the question was. And if you want to see the equations, you have to raise your hand and say, I want to see the equations. And then you get to, but I'm betting I won't see that. Or go read the book. So this is an exercise. Suppose we start, everything's fine. But suppose in fact the government drops money, sends everybody a check, and makes it clear that money, that debt is not going to be repaid by future surpluses. So people just think that debt's out there and the government's never going to pay it back. They try to get rid of it, they try to spend it. What happens? The case here is a 1% of GDP shock. We just had actually a 30% of GDP shock. And at the same time, suppose the central bank does nothing, which is actually pretty much what the central banks just did. So what happens to the economy in that circumstance? Well, the prediction is high inflation. Inflation jumps up and then slowly comes back down again. The price level doesn't jump, the price level just starts rising. And by the way, there's a little boomlet here because this is a new Keynesian model than a Phillips curve, but some inflation causes a little bit of a boom. So there's some graphs. What does this mean? The government dropped this extra debt with no plans to pay it back. We've got to have inflation. And in fact, look at that. There's a period of inflation higher than the nominal interest rate. So the real interest rate is negative. So if you were a bondholder at the beginning of this, you see a period of negative real interest rates while the government slowly inflates away your debt. Somebody's got to pay for these checks that got sent out. They're not getting paid by future taxes, right? They're not getting paid by cuts in spending. So they have to be paid by essentially defaulting on the initial debt. The way we default on that debt is by inflating away that debt over a period of years and low real returns on that debt. So I hope that's intuitive. You can see what's coming. That's going to be a major story for what happened in 2021. John turns in drafted fiscal theory at the price level, and the government did just what I told them not to do. The government did exactly what the monetary theorists and the R less than G crowd told them to do. Send out a bunch of debt and don't worry about repayment. It'll never get inflation, and boom, we got some. So I hope that's intuitive, right? We send out a bunch of money or debt with no plans to soak it up with taxes. It's got to get inflated away. The way it gets inflated away with sticky prices is just this period of higher inflation than interest rates. Bondholders lose. In fact, we've done that. The debt to GDP ratio in the US went down about 10 percentage points. Why? Because inflation went up 10 percentage points. We inflated away 10% of the debt. We passed essentially a wealth tax and government bond. That's perhaps not surprising. What is surprising here is relative to discussions we were having last year. Notice this inflation goes away. The central bank does nothing. It sleeps. It's on vacation. Pretty much as our central banks work. Does that inflation once started spiraling away? You probably heard, oh, inflation's coming and central banks are asleep. Inflation will spiral away out of control. No. Inflation goes away gently all on its own. Why? Well, we're having inflation it's inflating away the debt. Back to where it was before. And once that's done, it's done. You don't set off a permanent inflation here, just enough to inflate away the debt. And that's a major important point. Inflation is stable. In this view, in this theory, inflation eventually, if there's no more fiscal problems, inflation comes back to wherever the interest rate is. This is a picture of an economy under an interest rate target that is stable all on its own and comes back to where you started. Okay, who had the question?
Yeah.
Yes.
It just wouldn't be an alternative. It's really that there's an actual default of the government. Like you do not have salaries as well.
Yes. So
The other option.
the other option is default, either default or inflation. So I'm going to write down, of course, you can mix them. You can have models with some default and some inflation. And it's always a choice of governments. Do we default? Do we inflate? Default has costs. Inflation has costs. I'm going to show you graphs in my remaining half hour where we just assume no default. We always inflate it away. Because that seems to be the habit of our governments these days, but not always. And if you borrowed in foreign currency, then you can't inflate, so that Argentina would love to inflate away its dollar debt, but the US isn't cooperating, so it has to default. Yeah, Volker.
Maybe I have one more question. So you said, what if Milton Friedman could speak about this? And so he might actually, just like you, say, well, but in 2020, 21, there was a massive increase in broad money growth in the US, in the euro area. And so in terms of the sequel, right, it matches also the MV equal PY. So in a sense, I would at least say that the episode does not necessarily throw out I think there's a monetary fiscal link, but it doesn't throw out the role of M.
The problem is quantity of money went up. This time it didn't go up previously. All of a sudden, money suddenly became correlated with inflation, which had been asleep for 30 years. But that's money demand, not money supply. So I perfectly agree. If as nominal GDP goes up, nominal spending on chewing gum goes up. That doesn't mean that controlling nominal spending on chewing gum is going to control nominal GDP. The quantity of money went up, but central banks were not controlling the quantity of money. So that entirely reflects, yes, money demand went up, inflation went up, and money demand went up. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. We're back to the 1960s. If you recognize the quote from was that Bob Solow or Jim Tobin? If they're not controlling the money supply, then you're just seeing the endogenous response of money demand to inflation. You're not seeing the central bank causing the inflation from money supply. I haven't convinced them, but maybe I'll say it a third or fourth time louder. Sort of standard American tourists, they don't understand you once, you scream it louder and hopefully they will. Okay, the second exercise, second natural thing to do, this was what if we have a fiscal shock with no monetary policy? And in the real life, you always have both, but what if there's a monetary policy change with no fiscal policy? Or what could the ECB do about this problem? So let's, I want to think about them individually first, and then we'll add them up together. So this graph's a little complicated, but on the top, the blue dashed line, let's suppose the central bank raises interest rates and leaves them there forever. And this is crucial, there is no change in fiscal policy at the same time. So neither does fiscal policy also tighten, responding to whatever events got the monetary policy to tighten, nor is there any reactions of fiscal policy to the inflation and output that's going to happen. In reality, of course, you do this and there's going to be fiscal stimulus, but we're going to turn that off. What can the central bank do all by itself?
So John, the action, as you said, the primary surplus. Of course, the government will have a higher deficit because of the higher interest.
No. Yes.
Overall deficit.
Higher overall deficit, but no change in primary surplus. Now, there's a concept, there's no right or wrong question to ask. There's only interesting and boring questions to ask. This is one interesting question. There's lots of other, for your job, if you need to give policy advice, you want to say, what happens if we raise interest rates and fiscal policy, pays for unemployment insurance because of that? That's a different question. I just want to know, what could the central bank do all by itself? Now, the first uncomfortable part is the right-hand part of this graph. We raise interest rates and notice in the long run, inflation goes up. What? Raise interest rates and inflation goes up? But that's inevitable when you think about it. We have a theory that is stable. The economy does not blow up on its own, and it has to be in the long run neutral. Higher interest rates have to be higher inflation eventually. Right? Because real things always eventually go back to where they were. So a higher nominal interest rate has to mean a higher real interest rate, higher nominal interest rate has to be higher inflation eventually, 10 years, 20 years, I don't know when. And if the economy is stable, then it's got to be the inflation that does the adjusting. That's hard to swallow, but it's a logically inevitable conclusion. Now, the long run's very long. We don't tend to see the long run very often. So it's perfectly natural that nobody noticed this in real life until 2008, so it's in a moment. That's uncomfortable, but a logical conclusion. It's very hard to avoid in a stable model. But the important part here is the short run. Raising interest rates lowers inflation in the short run. So the model produces the conventional central banker and policy intuition that higher interest rates can lower inflation in the short run. Now, it's not conventional aggregate demand lowers interest spending and so forth. It's a completely different mechanism. The mechanism is by inflating away the long-term bonds, you make the short-term bonds more valuable. And so that they actually, people try to buy them and not buy as many goods and services, which is a hard effect to try to explain to newspapers, but that's what's going on in the model. And then just a reminder, Plots that look like traditional intuition don't always have traditional intuition going. Now, this is back to Volcker's question. Notice this unpleasant arithmetic going on here. The only way that the central bank causes lower inflation today is by causing higher inflation out in the future. The central bank cannot eliminate inflation. Inflation has to come from not enough surpluses, and disinflation has to come from more surpluses. If we don't change the surpluses, then all the central bank can do is rearrange inflation over time, exactly as Sergeant Wallace told us, but not by printing money, but simply by the path of interest rates. So
plus long-term debt.
yes, the long-term debt's crucial in this. It's about the omega equals 1 line. So that shows you what happens in short-term debt where this mechanism doesn't work. So we needed 2 frictions to get the central bank. Now, I don't think this is the right answer. And those of you who are pursuing PhDs, this is a model that gets something that looks like the right answer. Higher interest rates, lower inflation in the short run, raise it in the long run, maybe. I'd love a much better mechanism and write your PhD on that. But I think a flavor of this answer is what we're. So you have fiscal and monetary policy. How about the Taylor rule? Now, my office is next to John Taylor's at Hoover, so I always have something nice about the Taylor rule. But there is something nice about the Taylor rule that I have to mention here. Imagine you're a central bank. This just happened to you. There was a fiscal shock showing up inflation. And what can't we do something about this rather than simply wait for it to go away? Yes, you could do this. Wouldn't it be nice for the central bank to raise interest rates in response to this inflation so we can have this disinflation and the two can offset each other and we can do our best about inflation? And in fact, an automatic way of doing that is if you see inflation, automatically raise interest rates when you see inflation. What if the central bank, that happens, the central bank adds some of that, but let's do it automatically by automatically raising interest rates anytime you see inflation. And that's the result. So this is the same model, the same fiscal shock hits, but now the interest rate, rather than staying at 0, the interest rate goes up because the central bank endogenously responds to the endogenous amount of inflation we have. And look how pretty this is. Rather than a big period of inflation with output wandering around, you get a very small inflation, no change in output, because output here depends on the time pattern. And the central bank can't get rid of inflation. What it can do is really slowly devalue the government debt, rather than devalue the government debt more quickly, make it fall more on long-term bondholders than short-term bondholders. But doing so, reduce the volatility of inflation and eliminate the volatility of output. This is a good thing to do.
Effectively, you have increased the target, the inflation target.
Well, because you're following that. So the inflation target is as a theta pi minus target. I haven't changed the target. I'm permanently responding to the inflation.
So you permanently miss the target.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now you can also come down in the long run. What really matters here is to inflate away the long-term debt. So you can also come back down. I just didn't want to show. So this is the Taylor rule in this model. Taylor rule is wonderful because the answer stays the same, only the questions change. And usually that's an insult, but here it's John Taylor's main point. It works well in lots of models. In some models, it makes it stable. In some models, it turns multiple equilibria. In this model, it reduces volatility, but it's still a good principle. Anyway, the big picture, we're done with theory. What should you remember? 2 good exercises. A fiscal shock leads to inflation. It inflates away debt, and inflation goes away kind of on its own. A monetary shock, I showed you a second graph that I skipped over, but monetary shock, higher interest rates can temporarily lower inflation at the cost of raising inflation later on. So central banks are still really important. So let's take these stories out.
But can I just?
Yes, because I'm going to go on to real life.
The theta was equal to 1.
Yes.
How does it look if theta is above 1?
That's not a good idea. So the little slight thing we don't mention when John's within earshot is that in this model, the coefficient has to be equal or less than 1. What happens if it's greater than 1 is you induce instability. And the economy here is already stable on its own. So you don't want to do something that induces instability. And the Taylor rule in classic models, the economy is unstable. So you need to cross one to make it stable. In New Keynesian models, the economy is multiple equilibria. So you have to cross one to make it deterministic. This model, inflation is already stable and determinate. So we don't want to change any eigenvalues of the system. So responding with anything less than or equal to one is good. That's the one asterisk on the table. Don't overdo it.
Okay.
Well, actually, in more complex models, you can exceed one. The key you don't want to do is have the policy rule change a system eigenvalue. And it can still be greater than one so long as it doesn't change the system eigenvalue.
But so in this model, you promised not to show the equations, which is good, but can you tell us or can you remind me again, what was the difference then from a New Keynesian model in this model? What makes it a key change in the structure?
The difference is that this is the model. It is the New Keynesian model. The difference is that I pick my equilibria by the condition that there's no change in surpluses, rather than pick my equilibria some other way and assume that a change in surpluses will come along to make it happen. And given the time, I'm not going to explain the craziness of New Keynesian models and how this is different. But we can do that. We have napkins to talk about that over dinner. Let's talk about the events. So any theory you want, at least stories about history, and that's what I have to offer. So one great puzzle is what happened in the zero bound era. How do we interpret? I'll interpret as many events as we have time for. I'll start with the zero bound era. So financial crisis, inflation, deflation slowly broke out. Lots of people worried about, here comes 1933 again, deflation spiral, so forth. It didn't happen. Then a long period of interest rates stuck at zero when inflation kind of batted around. So how do we digest that episode? Well, let me show you three theories, the three current theories, including a little bit of New Keynesian, on how we think about, now I have to show you three theories, not just my theory, but this is a test that distinguishes three theories. So the most standard theory of inflation, the one that's in the minds of all policymakers really to this day, everybody sticks with the theory they learned in graduate school, and everybody my age first met the 1976 edition of Dornbush and Fisher's ISLM textbook. You won't have heard this. It's like the third book of the Bible as far as history is concerned. But that's what goes on in policymakers' minds, no matter how many equations of New Keynesian models they pretend to look at afterwards. And in that view of the world, inflation is unstable. So it's still true that higher interest rate means higher inflation, but this is an unstable relationship, so that if we raise the interest rate, inflation will fall off in the wrong direction. The economy is inherently unstable under an interest rate plan. That's sort of the number one doctrine starting in 1968. And another way to look at instability is my friend the seal. The ball is unstable on the seal's nose. Now, in that world, if I notice that even though higher interest rate is higher inflation in the long run, if I raise interest rates, inflation goes down in the short run. So that's how they got this idea that it goes the other way in the short run. That's quite different from what I showed you. Now, how do we repair that? Of course, the central bank has to be like the seal. If the central bank moves the interest rate more than 1 for 1 with every movement of the ball, that will bring stability back to inflation. But there's a clear prediction of this theory. If the seal is trying to balance the ball and hits the edge of its head, i.e. zero interest rates, and can't go any lower, boom, the ball's going to fall off. We're going to have inflation. So classic theory clearly said, hit the zero bound, deflation spiral, here we come. You read all the op-eds in 2008, and it was, holding signs, the end of the world was coming. It's 1933 again. Do something radical. Now, the fundamental reason for the instability here comes down to adaptive expectations. Everything in economics Modern macroeconomics, the crucial difference between Keynesian and modern is intertemporal. We think about things over time, not each year as its own slices. So when we think about inflation, we have to think about what do we expect inflation for next year? And the key assumption that gives you instability is that people think about inflation next year mechanically by looking at what happened last year. And the result of that is, imagine you're driving down the freeway, the Autobahn, and you're looking in the rearview mirror to try to guess where the road is ahead. What's going to happen? That's an unstable system, right? So looking in the past for your expectations of the future, boom, up the road we go. And that's exactly why these models predict instability. But starting in the 1970s, we started thinking about people as being not quite that dumb. I don't want to go so far as rational expectations, but at least thinking about the future. And more importantly, the people in the model shouldn't be much dumber than the model. It doesn't make sense to write down a model that if people read it, they wouldn't change their minds. So the expectations of the model should be the expectations in the model. That's a lot less than rationality. And if people behave that way when they think about their expectations, well, now they drive down the road looking forwards. And if they look forwards, even if they're not totally rational, their glasses are a little bit foggy, or the windshield is kind of dirty, they're going to eventually steer back to the road. So stability comes from rational expectations. Well, if inflation is stable, that's the fundamental in the model I just showed you. That's stability. Inflation going away fundamentally isn't about fiscal theory. It's fundamentally about people eventually catching on and starting to think about things looking forwards. Now, the one thing I'll say about New Keynesian economics is that it uses this forward-looking expectations, but it's missing an equation, so there's multiple equilibria. So what it says happens when you hit the zero bound, and they were quite honest about this. They say this is a disaster, not because we're going to spiral off 1933, but because there's going to be sunspots, multiple equilibria, immense inflation volatility. So they made a clear prediction. Whereas the fiscal theory says, no, there's just one equilibrium. We pick the one. Which one? The one with the present value of surpluses. So that's where it fits in. You just pick one of those things by the present value of surpluses. And so you get not only stable, but you get only one number and therefore quiet. So in summary, three theories. Hit the zero bound. One predicts deflation spiral. The other predicts stable, but really volatile. It breaks out. And in fact, that's what they said was wrong with the 1970s. The third one says it's stable, it's stable and it's quiet so long as there isn't any bad fiscal news. Bad fiscal policy, but not particularly fiscal news. So unstable, stable with volatility, or quiet. Which one did we see? I hope now it's obvious what the answer is going to be. We knew what was coming. This picture is exactly consistent with stable and quiet, not unstable and not incredibly volatile. Yes.
Question on monetary policy. Isn't it too simplistic just look at the short-term interest rate? I mean, you would have something like forward guidance, this easing, and those crazy measures, then try to actually look at something like a shadow interest rate. Wouldn't that be then the story still be the same?
Okay, now give me a heck. Thank you. Because now I get to have some fun. Suppose we want to rescue this view of the world. No. It's just like, I'll tell the story. I'm a boat captain. And, it was really quiet for a nice long night. Oh, boy, I slept really well on this cruise. Got to meet the captain. Thank you. It was a really quiet night last night. And the captain says, no. It was not a quiet, determinate night last night. On the left, the hurricane of hyperinflation. On the right, the vast whirlpool of the deflationary spiral. And I, your captain, I saw the deflationary spiral coming, but I threw in just enough quantitative easing and forward guidance speeches and all the rest of it. And I, your captain, kept you right on the straight course and nothing happened. Could be, you can rescue any theory with epicycles, but I'll appeal to Occam's Razor. The theory that says it was stable and quiet is a lot simpler. It's not proof. Yes.
So, the proof in the pudding is that it was stable in the US without unpleasant fiscal surprises. Okay.
Europe, and you didn't pay it. But in Europe, we had like sovereign debt crisis, probably unpleasant fiscal news there. Yet interest rates stuck at the zero lower bound or tight or slightly below, and pretty stable inflation. So how can you squeeze that into your theory? Well, it's always the problem is it's too easy to squeeze in the theory because all I have to say is no terrible fiscal news. And again, remember, it's not deficits, it's deficits relative to eventual ability over decades to repay, and especially with very low interest costs. The big thing that happened in the 2010s was interest costs on the debt were next to nothing. And so economists and politicians by the end of the 2010s convinced themselves, we never have to pay off government debt. Don't worry about it because R less than G will come rescue us from anything. So, maybe people had some of that attitude too, that those deficits would get grown out of or repaid or whatever. But debt and deficits that get grown out of and repaid are not a problem. And in fact, what actually got spent, Draghi had this miraculous, whatever it takes, he didn't have to spend anything. And Greece, Greece kind of blew up and Germans got taxed to pay for Greece, but it wasn't that much. Greece wasn't that big. So there actually wasn't that much bad fiscal news in that. Fair enough, except that, you had the fear that not just small countries could potentially leave the currency area. And that I would say is, you mentioned Argentina, that would be very unpleasant. Yes. Many unpleasant things were avoided, but in the expected present value surpluses, the problem with the theory is not that it makes such sharp predictions that you can reject it with, well, what about Greece? What about Turkey? What about Japan? The problem really is that it's so flexible. It's like present value of dividends. Twitter goes up. And, why did Twitter go up? Well, the present value dividends must have gone up. The problem is it's too flexible, not that it's not flexible.
Yeah, but of course you had, argue whatever it says, together with fiscal conditionality. So the surplus, which John showed before, the expectation that there will eventually be a surplus in Spain and Italy and so on, was created by the second big element of OLT, whatever it takes, namely the conditionality of the program.
Klaus was there and he did it. So let's
I'm
sorry?
I did part of it, but not
But the whole idea was to force Greece to do this. And if you can force Greece to do that, then the debt does not cause, the extra debt doesn't cause, or you can force any government to do that, then the extra debt doesn't cause inflation. And so, create institutions that guarantee repayment. Yeah, and Japan 27 years. So how many years can we offset instabilities by artful planning, or do we just look at it and say, oh, inflation is stable and determinate, even at an interest rate peg, with the uncomfortable logical implication, if it's unstable and determinate at an interest rate peg at zero, raise that interest rate peg, and eventually, once all the short-run dynamics have worked themselves out, it's got to go up again. Hard to swallow, but maybe true. Let's talk about actually the other, what about our friends, the monetarists? What about QE? Another view of what about QE in the zero bound era. The red arrow is what you're supposed to pay attention to. This again, I'm sorry, US centric. I made US graphs, but Europe did the same thing. In the financial crisis, reserves in the US were 10 billion, and they went up to 4,000 billion, a 400% increase in the money supply. Now, if you think that that reserves, it comes down to, now this is a classic open market operation. The Fed bought securities and issued money, so there was no change in the overall amount of debt, just the composition of debt. So that's the classic test of monetarism. Let's do an open market operation 4,000 times bigger than anybody has ever seen. No, 400 times bigger than anything anybody has ever seen before. And what happens? Nothing. Now, we're arguing still about QE. Was it worth 10 basis points in the long-term rate? I don't know. But this is an atom bomb. You raise money from 10 to 4,000. We should be talking Zimbabwe or Argentina. So the first order again, we got our test, exchange M for B and absolutely nothing. So that's a nice clear experience. Let's talk a little about current events. Oh boy, I better be quick. So what's going on now? Again, I turn in the book manuscript, inflation comes out, but the central bank sat there for a long time and didn't do anything. and then finally started raising interest rates. How do we think about that event? Well, this just documents in 2021 during the pandemic, the US did about $5 trillion worth of a helicopter drop. And you can see that here's the money that Volcker referred to, M2 is money. And I'm just going to use to me, what that just says is that they did it in an especially potent form. They sent people checks. It's not just government spending that through some multiplier raises income. No, people got checks. And of course, that if you think about that in terms of the fiscal theory, that is exactly this experiment. So no surprise when you got inflation. Now that too is not so obvious. Again, it's not about debt, it's debt relative to expectations of future repayment. Why in this time did people not think it was going to get repaid? And they did in 2008. And there's lots of reasons one can point to. And now here I'm telling stories. One of the most important is that this time, our government, last in 2008, at least they had the decency to say, we're going to pay it back. Deficit now, deficit reduction later. Ha, ha, ha. Well, at least they said it. Whereas this time, nobody said anything in the story. It was all modern monetary theory, R less than G. Don't worry, we don't have to worry about that. So, you can tell a story. The second thing that happened is Volcker and I were together at a conference last May, right about here. And the big question was, once again, the opposite of 2008, where the inflation, the central bank isn't doing anything, and all the inflation spirals said, wait a minute, here comes the great inflation spiral. As long as interest rates stay below inflation, it's going to explode. And I actually, in both of these cases, I never make forecasts because then you can prove me wrong. But I did go out and say, this is going to cause inflation, and that one can eventually go away on its own because it eventually goes away on its own. And it did start eventually going away on its own. Furthermore, the central bank raised interest rates, and boy, doesn't that look a lot like monetary policy having that effect of also helping to bring things down. That, however, shouldn't give you too much happiness because, of course, this plot says you bring down inflation now by future inflation. So, unless something bad happens, we may get. It helps to bring things down, but not all the way back down. And then we have a period of kind of stubborn inflation. At least that's what this simple model says. We go back to the 1970s and 1980s in 2 minutes. This is usually the triumph of the traditional view. Here is inflation and interest rates. And inflation got worse in the 1970s. And then finally, our central bankers all grew a spine, raised interest rates, and the very high interest rates supposedly brought inflation back down again. The victory of the courageous central banker and the power of monetary policy. What about fiscal theory? Is that the right story? Well, it's certainly part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And what did happen in the 1970s and 1980s? First, notice 1975, inflation came down all on its own without interest rates much greater than inflation. So it's not always and everywhere. It can also happen. And so I kind of worry, this is kind of what I worry about for right now, that we might be in 75. The important question is what happened in 1980? And notice, put your fiscal eyes on, and notice these plots. Two important things happened. First, for a decade, interest costs on the debt were next to nothing. Now, interest costs on the debt for a decade were very high. Who paid those? Second, if you bought bonds in 1980 at 20%, you got paid off. You were expecting 15% inflation. You got paid off in 5% inflation. Where did the money come from to pay that huge windfall to the 1980s bondholders? Answer, taxpayers. This monetary tightening had to have fiscal policy help to pay the interest costs on the debt and the great return to taxpayers. And in fact, here's fiscal policy in the 1980s. The crucial thing to notice in 1980, the supposedly huge Reagan deficits were actually not that big in terms of primary surpluses, especially when you realize there was a huge recession going on. 1975 was even bigger than 1980. So there was no huge Reagan deficit. And then look at the surpluses. In fact, the US moved towards a period of substantial fiscal surpluses, in part because we had a tax reform lowered tax rates from 70 to 28%, and with deregulation, the economy boomed. We reformed Social Security, the big looming present value surplus thing, and we had huge economic growth, whether by skill or by luck. But by 1990, by the end of 2000, by the beginning of 2000, people were writing papers, what happens when we pay off all the government debt? You have to be careful about writing papers about current events because it takes 4 years to publish them, and that can be. But at least you can see in the fiscal policy, this was a joint fiscal monetary stabilization. It had to include fiscal policy to pay the interest costs on the debt and the windfall to bondholders, and it happened. We moved to substantial primary surplus. The present value of surpluses did in fact account for that deflation. And I want to close, since it's Germany, on the big one, the 1920s in Germany. Notice the exponents on the left-hand side. If there's sort of a cultural aversion to inflation in Germany, this is why. Immense German hyperinflation. And notice its end. This is the price level. Bing! It ended on a dime with no high interest rates. In fact, greater money growth. No monetary tightness. What happened? What happened was that Germany had an impossible fiscal situation. It had to pay money to the allies that it couldn't possibly pay. So it was printing money to try and pay it. Once they fixed the fiscal situation, bing, inflation ended on a dime. And in fact, with no unemployment, the economy grew because you got rid of horrible inflation. So painless disinflation is possible if you do it with a joint fiscal, monetary, and usually microeconomic reform. So things are not great looking at the future. This is the US fiscal projections from the Congressional Budget Office. That is, I'll just summarize, bad. And even the projections assume nothing bad happens in the future. If we have another great recession or a pandemic, things could be even worse. And the central problem is we have huge primary surpluses going forward. So I don't think inflation is whipped in any sense for the long. Well, I was going to talk about fiscal and the euro, but sorry, we're 2 minutes over, so I'll stop there. Sorry, Klaus, there's all your beautiful graphs. Wouldn't that be nice? The euro faces a similar issue, period. Thank you so much.
I think since we're in Europe and in Germany, and we're actually not that much sticking to rules anymore, even in Germany in many ways. So I think we can still, if there are some questions on Europe and the fiscal and maybe enticing a prediction from you based on the theory, we can still handle 2 or 3 questions, I think.
As long as people are willing to stay on it.
But we want to stop, before all questions are answered.
Oh, okay.
So then they come back next time, but okay.
But simple.
Yeah.
I have one simple question. You talked about the time of inflationary relative stability that we had. If inflation numbers would count as instability, as not as stable or volatile, stable but volatile.
I'm telling stories. I'm not doing econometrics. So, here's Europe. And so in both cases, well, you can see in the US, it was more stable at the zero bound than it was before when the Fed could change interest rates. So I'll at least go with that was less volatile than that. Same is true in Europe, but they just don't show you the left-hand part of the graph. If I were a central banker and I saw this kind of inflation, between 0.8 and 1.5, I would say, we're going on vacation. We're darn costs when even Italy falls. Mission accomplished. But I'm telling you, this is qualitative, and I want to encourage qualitative.
Another question there.
Yeah, maybe back to your first chart that you had on the 3 scenario. It was number 1 and number 2. Exactly. Where do you think we are today in Europe and in Europe?
Great uncertainty. I'm an efficient markets kind of person, so I don't want to. The market clearly thinks we did. I would interpret what happened in the pandemic is this. But we inflated that away. So our current deficits don't seem to be adding that much to inflation. So I do think, why do we have so much debt and not inflation already? Despite, why do bond markets look at, this comes out, I want to, the Congressional Budget Office prints this graph every year and says this is unsustainable. It's going to fall apart sooner or later. And yet bond markets seem completely happy. But one answer to that is, well, Greece looked fine in 2006. Everything looked fine until it doesn't. But the other answer is this is a self-imposed move. This is not necessary. The US can fix this. Put us together in a room, tell us we're a bipartisan commission to solve this, will be done before dinner. It's not economically hard. So I think bond markets, it's not an expectation, it's an expectation of stability of institutions. And that, as we always do, the US will finally do the right thing after we've tried everything else. We don't know quite what that right thing is or when it's going to be, but that faith can disappear. So I think there's still faith that somehow or other they won't let this happen. But I think there's more uncertainty about that than there was.
Looking at the lower chart, I would expect the present value of government debt to be negative. I think this wouldn't make sense. Then there would be automatically some kind of hyperinflation or something in your model. What do you think about this?
Same answer. That actual markets. So this is a projection, and it says if current law is followed and you don't make any changes, here's what's going to happen. But the loud, bold italics 40-point font on the front says, change this. Don't let this happen. Do something different. So it's not a conditional expectation, which is what you want to put into a model. It's a projection of what will happen if you leave things as they are now. So I think sooner or later, we're going to fix this. And one way or another, so we could fix it. You can't fix this with inflation, right? Because this is promised future indexed health and medical payments. So, you can inflate away the current debt if you want, but then you got to reform this stuff. So sooner or later, the U.S. will either reform its social welfare system, or it will pass European taxes in order to pay for European welfare. We have a European welfare system and American taxes. We don't believe in taxing the middle class. We have huge taxes on the rich, but middle class people pay not a 20% VAT, a 10% sales tax. Our income tax rate on somebody who's earning $100,000 is maybe 20%, not 50%. Our payroll taxes for middle class people are 15%, not 40%. Get where I'm going here? All we got to do is adopt the European tax system. This is gone, or reform the entitlements. So that will change. It has to change, is the answer to that question. And bond markets think it will. Or if they ever think that this will actually happen, boom, we go to infinity, just like you said. Well, I think we've tried everyone's patience. One last one. Okay.
How important are interest rates and reserves from this? For example, could I say that when there are interest rates and reserves, it comes to the foreground, but when there's none and there's a difference between interest on debt and interest on money, but then the monetarist theory comes to the foreground?
Not really important at all. At least so. This is the size of QE. So to first order, reserves are just interest paying overnight government debt. And they're being held at positive interest rates, large quantities of it. Now, if we decide we're not going to pay interest on reserves, then we have to undo this because no one's going to hold 4 trillion in reserves and not get interest on it. And the same in Europe, if you stop paying interest on reserves, then you have to do a quick QT and get rid of all those reserves. But then people are they're holding interest paying 1 month treasuries instead of interest paying reserves. That doesn't make much difference.
Can I ask you a quick question on that?
Yeah.
I mean, some people are proposing now to actually do that, not pay interest, but keep the high assets, the high reserves by just raising the reserve requirement to be huge. So thanks for that. So what would you think of that proposal?
Okay, so if you stop paying interest on reserves and there's no reserve requirement and you don't get rid of them, now you're going to get some inflation. So you either need to lower the quantity of reserves down to the existing reserve requirement, which is next to nothing, or you have to raise the reserve requirement, which then what you're doing, that's financial repression. You're basically saying you must lend me money and I'm not going to pay you a market interest on it. And that's actually a classic technique of indebted governments. So we may end up with what governments did after World War II. Governments who want you to hold their government debt and don't want inflation, how do they do it? They pass laws to force you to hold the government debt. And one of those, so reserve requirements is just an example. You got to hold $4 trillion of government debt and we're not going to pay you interest on it. Why? Because boom, you do it or we send you to jail. Similarly, you pass capital controls. You're not allowed to go buy stocks in the US. You got to hold bank accounts that we hold down the interest rates here in Germany. Financial repression. That's what we did throughout the post-war era to force people to hold government debt at overvalued prices. So that's one way. The path to default is not a clean, everything's hunky-dory, free market, boom, we default. Path of trying to contain excess government debt contains high taxes, wealth taxes, and a lot of financial repression. And that proposal is an example of financial repression. We're just going to grab 3% a year out of 4 trillion and send it to our fiscal pockets. But it doesn't, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, that's good. So we are at the end of the talk. One thing though inspired me, I mean, you showed the picture of the Congressional Budget Office, which is an independent institution, published things will get very bad if you don't change policy. Maybe we need something like that in Europe, an independent authority which tells governments clearly with pictures like that, hey, if you keep doing this, something very bad will happen. Wait a minute, what's that the charm of the European Commission? Anyway, so there's more to come. Our next lecture. Oh, one thing I wanted to say, you also have this fantastic blog of the Grumpy Economist. You didn't show us enough grumpiness today, but nevertheless, I wanted to mention that to students. It's an interesting blog to follow. And finally, we will have another book presentation coming up end of March, on March 23rd by Maria Rovini on mega threats. And so maybe this will also be something of interest.
I got that. Yeah.